little bit about the big picture to help myself. So I take my understanding of decolonization largely from Marxist decolonial theorists, working in the kind of tradition of M.A. Césaire. Particularly, I'm very interested in Frantz Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Now, for these guys, one of the things that a decolonial theory needs to work through is the legacy of the economic reorganization of colonies. And we heard yesterday about how the introduction of an economic system can be a form of violence. And it's kind of some of the legacies of that I'm trying to think through, not just today, but in my research more broadly. I kind of, when writing this, tried to step back and kind of strip back my general research questions. And kind of what I'm broadly interested in is figuring out what it is that capitalism does to language, or how capitalism itself kind of shapes the importance of language in social life. So actually, that's not very original of me necessarily. It's a question that Ngugi asked in the 1970s, but it's taken sociolinguists a long time to catch up and to begin to offer any kind of serious, theoretically robust consideration of language and capitalism. And in some cases, I think part of what we need to do, as Tony was saying yesterday actually, is to reflect on the kind of terms that we use to understand the things that we're looking at. And it's in this vein that I want to take a critical look at how we think about the social role of language in education policy, with this particular focus on Rwanda as a kind of example. It works. So I recommended two pieces of reading ahead of this talk, one of which is a piece that I wrote a few years back. As that piece outlines, in October 2008, the Rwandan government unilaterally declared that state education would from then on be entirely taught through English. And this completed what has been generally described as a kind of shift to English from French. I'm going to leave that aside, kind of what happened there, but if anyone wants to ask about it, I will happily talk it through. So as I outlined in the recommended article, and as other scholars have observed as well, the rhetoric behind this implementation is one of economic transformation. It's argued that an English-speaking workforce will attract foreign direct investment, and that transnational capitalist operations will set up shop in cities like Kigali, and that they will provide good opportunities, good work opportunities for Rwandans. Most importantly, I think, there's a compelling narrative here that the everyday Rwandan will learn English and their life will be improved. They'll access better paid work, which will mean they have better leisure opportunities, and so on and so on. I mean, we all know how money works, right? It makes things better, broadly speaking. But you if you haven't. Now, the mass education system is envisaged as the kind of mechanism for this, what I've called in the paper, Rwandan Renaissance. But there are at least two key problems here. One, as I kind of outline in the paper, is that even now, some 14 years later, there appear to be very few work opportunities that actually require some competence in English. This is obviously a fundamental problem, but I want to set it aside for a moment. The other major issue is that the access to education is starkly uneven. Material barriers like unofficial fees and uniform costs keep poorer children from being able to attend schools, as does the fact that many children are kind of periodically taken out of school to help on family farms or are engaged in other kind of household economic enterprises. Now, I argued in the 2018 paper that English itself constitutes another barrier for poorer students. Most students in Rwanda are tasked with learning through a language they don't understand. But those from wealthier families at least have the opportunity to kind of hire tutors, practice with English-speaking family members, and indeed to enroll in more expensive schools where teachers are more competent in English. This last point is really important in Rwanda because there's a lot of pressure to only use English in classroom, a lot of top-down pressure that's felt very strongly. Teachers have little kind of space to negotiate policy themselves. So in poorer schools where teachers have weaker English skills, not only are children hampered in terms of their ability to learn the language, but they often face difficulties in learning subject content as well, to the extent you can kind of separate those things. The result, which I'm sure will be very familiar to those of you who study education systems around the globe, is that access to wealth becomes this kind of major factor in determining success in school. Now, these issues are not all specific or unique to Rwanda. EMI scholars have studied them in context throughout the globe. And there are two kind of questions I want to ask here. The first is, how is this whole enterprise of EMI conceptualized in this body of scholarship? And the second is, what kind of solutions actually stem from that way of understanding how EMI works? Now, very often, scholars make use of Bourdieu's idea of linguistic capital. We've heard a bit about it today, in fact, and I'm not kind of trying to throw that away, as we'll see. Simply right, this is the notion that a particular form of language, English, for example, is seen as being more valuable than other forms of language. Now, for Bourdieu, speaking a highly valued form of language allows one to claim this kind of symbolic capital, linguistic capital, which in the right circumstances can be traded for economic capital, money broadly, but other things as well, assets and so on, and social capital, the kind of connections that we have that also help us make money. Speaking English in this kind of view, right, can potentially help the speaker to get the right friends, yeah, the right job, find themselves with the right kind of bank balance. The enterprise of teaching English then is seen as an exercise in giving students access to linguistic capital, at least in theory. And there is generally a presumption here that this capital is, as Bourdieu suggests that it is, worth something, and that all things being equal, it will have a positive effect on the student's life. That's a kind of conceptualization. Now, the method of disseminating this linguistic capital has come under a lot more scrutiny and more sustained critique. Scholars have detailed the kind of problems posed by the specific fact that EMI schools are often envisaged as having these monolingual classrooms where no other languages are kind of involved or allowed to be involved. I mean, as a recent kind of overview of the field, a good overview of the field, demonstrates, there are a whole range of kind of fixes that scholars are coming up with. I call them fixes deliberately, most of which are kind of pedagogical and attitudinal fixes. One of the most compelling, I think, one that I've done a kind of tiny bit of work on myself, is translanguaging. The translanguaging approach, I think, in my view, is more or less shown, kind of quite definitively, really, that one of the reasons that students struggle in school is because they're not allowed to use their entire repertoire, right? Because they're confined to operating within English or whatever it is. Of course, it's an uphill battle to get any kind of amendments to kind of allow translanguaging or any of these kind of practices in place, not least because stakeholders believe quite firmly that a monolingual approach to teaching is superior. But the idea, and the idea is really what I want to talk about, the idea is that with critical changes to the system itself, more of these students will be able to access English and hence linguistic capital. And thereby, they will have better futures in societies that give a prominent position to English. And to a certain extent, I don't really dispute this. I mean, it's clear to me that changes in pedagogy can make it easier to learn English. And if we take the example of Rwanda, as I kind of argue in that paper, there certainly are some jobs that are only accessible to English speakers. Still, and again, as I argued in that paper, these jobs are limited in number, with farming and mining with farming and increasingly mining, or shift from farming to mining, being the major kind of areas of economic activity that absorb the bulk of the workforce in Rwanda and continue to absorb the bulk of the workforce, the majority, literally the majority. So the structural constraints and access are also an important factor in this mix, and this all leads me to wonder how we're kind of thinking about social class in these discussions. Brings me on to social relations. So the other reading that I recommended for this talk is by David Block, who's written quite extensively on the issue of class in socio and applied linguistics. I'm just going to take a drink of water. Hold David Block's name in your mind while I do the water thing. The piece in question that I asked you guys to read was published just 4 years ago, okay? And it makes the case that despite the kind of critical and sophisticated theoretical perspectives on language that have emerged since the 1990s, studies in language policy and practice, and I would add studies in EMI, tend to under-theorize class. Now, interestingly, Block says that scholars tend to focus more on inequality than on class itself. The distinction, I think, and it's not entirely clear to me from reading Block, but this is what I think he means, is between the kind of actual phenomenon of unequal access to resources of inequality, whether they're symbolic resources or material resources, whatever they are, and the kind of structuring social force that seems to allocate greater resources to some systematically than it allocates to others. Now, as Block argues, fundamental to the concept of class is the idea of social relations, that people occupy a particular position in society in relation to other people. We might talk about social relations, for example, between bosses, workers, and investors, right? It's kind of really easy way that they might be encapsulated. So in social class and applied linguistics, Block provides an overview of how sociolinguists and applied linguists have thought about class since the 1960s. And one of the points he made, which was originally made by the brilliant John Rutherford in 1986, is that sociolinguistic studies often implicitly use so-called functionalist models of social class, borrowed from mid-century sociology. Rickford sets up a conflict is the wrong word here for a reason not become clear, a conflict between functionalist models and conflict models. That confused the whole thing. But he sets up this distinction between the two. The functionalist model, as he puts it, quote, focuses on society as an integrated system, its various parts, classes, performing different functions and receiving differential rewards according to the importance of their functions to the system and the level of education or the skills that they require. Okay. Now, the image here is perhaps a little bit facetious. I recognize that. It's the best visualization I could find here. But here, right, classes occupy spaces that are unequal, but separate, with this all-important ladder here, providing a way up or a way down for those with the right kind of capital, whether that is linguistic capital or other, if we kind of follow Bourdieu. So the key thing, right, is that they're separate, and you can move between them. Conflict models, on the other hand, sorry, Karen, I hope you got a chance to capture that. Conflict models tend to focus on the schisms within society rather than the whole, stressing divergences in interests and values between classes rather than commonalities, and seeing change as the product of class struggle, or, and I think this is really important, the transformation of society as a whole rather than individual effort. This is a much more famous image. Variations of this circulated in the 19th century, particularly in like French socialist movements. And it depicts class as relational in the sense that these guys at the bottom here, the workers, are kind of carrying everybody else on their back, right? It's the idea that it is people who are creating wealth through their labor, that they are the people who are actually creating the kind of wealth that circulates through society, which other people kind of appropriate in one way or another. Now, it's striking to me that work on EMI seems to take this functionalist approach as standard. Of course, I want to say this really clearly. I don't think this means that the writers behind these kind of articles on EMI actually buy into that model necessarily. To some extent, I think it's probably because the kind of social function of EMI falls outside the scope of an awful lot of the research. And I think we all know what it's like to be kind of held to a word count, right? But functionalism does seem to be the implicit logic behind the idea that children who gain linguistic capital can rise through the ranks of society, and moreover that this future is open to as many children as can learn the language. The logic of change in these discussions isn't an individualist one, it's a collective one, but it is not a systemic one. It's about making the system work better for groups of students and staff, but it isn't about transforming that system. This is particularly interesting to me because, as Block notes, the conflict tradition, it weaves through the likes of Karl Marx, where it kind of begins at least popularly, Max Weber, another very famous and influential sociologist, and, as it happens, Pierre Bourdieu, very much fits into this kind of line. Oh, okay, look, I missed 2 clicks. Sorry about that. So as I said, right, the concept of linguistic capital is widely used to understand language policy and education. But in a sense, this is often kind of digested or adapted to fit within this functionalist model of social class. Put another way, linguistic capital becomes abstracted from Bourdieu's larger critique of language and symbolic power. Now, Bourdieu conceives of linguistic capital as having a function within what he calls the linguistic market. And this is a metaphorical space where social value is allocated both to linguistic forms and to other cultural practices. Now, I think of this market as essentially, and certainly historically, a colonial structure. Part of what colonial powers did around the world was to create or impose linguistic markets, or else to intervene in existing linguistic markets and integrate them under the sponsorship of the colonial states. This generally meant introducing a system in which linguistic capital was allocated primarily to, you guessed it, European colonial languages. This speaks to a fundamental point that Park and we make about the market, that it is not supply and demand that regulates value, but it's practical relations of social power. So codes don't gain linguistic capital because they're in high demand or because they're in short supply, not necessarily because, as I argued in that paper, they're wanted by business even, but because they're used by those in power. At least that's Bourdieu's take. This means that codes themselves are embedded in relationships that mirror wider social relations, which for Bourdieu are absolutely conflictual relations between social classes. Now, there are two kind of points I want to make here. One is about this code that Bourdieu refers to, and the other is about the nature of linguistic capital in class society. Bourdieu is interested in what he calls the, quote, social laws of construction of dominant codes. Put another way, he tries to figure out what social processes turn a particular set of linguistic practices into something that we recognize as a legitimate code. And he glosses code, interestingly, as both a cipher and a system of norms regulating linguistic practices. And at certain points, he's clearly talking about what we refer to as language and dialects. He argues, for example, that in bilingual contexts, the legitimate code will be particular languages, while in class society, it will be a particular use of language, by which he kind of means a dialect. There's an obvious issue there, I think, in that Bourdieu doesn't make much explicit space at all for the role of social class in multilingual societies, but we'll set that aside for the moment. At other points, Bourdieu's use of code does not presume that the code in question is a named or bounded variety. Rather, it seems to be a particular set of semiotic resources drawn from one's wider linguistic repertoire that become, as a group, legitimate practices. Now, I think this is a useful point to draw out because it suggests that the code itself is not immovable or necessarily a named and recognized entity that exists like French or Standard English, to the extent that these things exist. The dominant code has no constant linguistic correlate, but what it does have, and this is key, I think, is a social correlate. Thus, Bourdieu argues, quote, all linguistic practices, are measured against the legitimate practices, i.e. the practices of those who are dominant. The important thing there is about who's using those practices more than it's about what those practices are. The legitimate code then is a movable target in a sense. What is much more stable is the legitimate speaker, right? The person, or more accurately the group of people, on whose linguistic practice legitimacy is based. And this leads me into my second point, that Bourdieu treats the actual code that holds linguistic capital as almost incidental, save for the fact that it's modelled on the practice of the dominant class. At his most pithy, perhaps reductive, he argues that, quote, a language is worth what those who speak it are worth. Out of context, this does sound reductive, but the idea is expanded on in greater detail in Language and Symbolic Power in 1991, where Bourdieu argues that there are social institutions that serve as arbiters of linguistic capital, not in the sense that they allocate linguistic capital to people, but in the sense that they allocate linguistic capital to particular codes, right? And that's a really important distinction. The school is one of these social institutions for Bourdieu, alongside other institutions that are closely aligned with the state, like the judiciary, parliaments, congresses, that kind of thing. His argument is that these institutions can sanction a code, recognition of which will by and large be, as he puts it, inculcated in everyday speakers. What's particularly interesting here in respect of linguistic social justice, and I also think conversations around global English, is that Bourdieu outright rejects the notion that legitimate language is able to reproduce itself, that it can ever be this kind of snowball effect. Rather, he argues that it can only continue to exist through, quote, the process of continuous creation, which occurs through the unceasing struggle between the different authorities who compete within the field of specialized production for the monopolistic power to impose a legitimate mode of expression. Okay, granted, that's a bit of a mouthful. I was really reluctant to put that on a slide. But basically, right, what he's saying is that linguistic capital is only allocated to a particular code because of the active and constant involvement of particular social groups, dominant social groups. To view it this way, and following Bourdieu, the education system is socially important in part because it teaches children to recognize one form of language as the best form of language, though it may not teach them how to speak it, right? And for Bourdieu, the key point about linguistic capital is precisely that not everybody can access it, and that in this way language becomes both part of the symbolic domination of ruling classes and also part of the reproduction of the existing class system. Part of this is that people who learn to use the code rise through the class system and kind of go through that mobility thing we talked about. The other part is those who fail to acquire the code find themselves stuck at the bottom of basically that pyramid that we saw described. Find themselves in forms of labour where they're creating wealth that is kind of taken from them through the structures of capitalist society. According to Bourdieu, I couldn't possibly comment. Now, to understand education this way, which aligns with conflict theorists and Bourdieu, is to suggest that dropouts or people who leave education without actually completing the entire course They don't represent a failing of the system, but rather they're built into the very design of the system. Block argues, rightly I think, that class-based inequality is endemic to capitalism. It has to be endemic to capitalism, because capitalism is premised on the wealth created by workers being taken as profit, at least in part, by their kind of superiors of one sort or another. I'm using that term very broadly. Someone who has the kind of drop on them, if you like, within that structure. Sorry, I'm one behind here. Now, as I argue in a forthcoming book chapter, within the current social and economic configuration of Rwanda, the majority of students leave education early, and with little choice but to take roles in farming and roles in mining, two of the largest sectors of the export economy. Denying access to linguistic capital is one of the mechanisms that keeps this socio-economic system in place, right? And in this kind of view, language policy actually helps to reproduce social relations. And this is in itself, and I think this is really important, a legacy of colonial political economy. It's something that was done self-consciously in Rwanda by Belgian colonists, something that was self-consciously reproduced by a so-called Francophone government, and it's something that is being reproduced now under a so-called Anglophone government. So what if all children in Rwanda did learn English? Would they climb that class ladder? Well, if Bourdieu is right, and of course he might not be right, but if he is right, then the code associated with linguistic capital would change, right? The dominant class would no longer be distinguished by English per se, but it would become distinguished by another set of linguistic practices. We only need to look at England or France, right, to see that so-called monolingual societies, however much erasure is kind of associated with that term, but so-called monolingual societies do not provide equal access to linguistic capital for all people who speak the national language, right? Or whatever we call it. So from a political economic perspective, part of the reason for this whole situation is that there need to be structures that help to sort people into different positions in the labour market to make people perform different kinds of labour, at least under capitalism, right? Now, most of this is there in Bourdieu's work, but somehow it drops out of the conversations that follow on from him, those conversations in EMI. It fits quite nicely, I think, with approaches that are taken by Frantz Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, both of whom put class critique at the centre of their discussions on language, both of whom are kind of trying to bring back into a kind of socio-linguistic discussion of what we do about English. I'm going to leave us here with a quote from Ngugi that I think hits the nail on the head, really. He says that the language question cannot be solved outside the arena of economics and politics, or, this is a bit I really like, outside the answer to the question of what kind of society we want. And on that lovely note, I'll say thank you.
Fantastic.
Yes, Rita.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm not. Sorry, Karen. I saw you under.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Kate, for all the inspiration. Actually, the direct inspiration for my thesis, because I researched language policy in this globalized Chinese context. Among all the interesting points you've mentioned, I have several questions. I will give it two. Sorry. The first one would be, I'm really curious about the language policy you were talking about in the Rwanda context. Say, for example, the onset age of the EMI or the resources all the schools have. Do we have equal trained teachers? Do we have all the equal used facilities, something like that? So let's suppose ideally all the schools are practiced by the EMI, but what about the individuals, the teachers, the students? And yeah, this is what I'm quite interested in. And also you talked about the languages, the language policy, this idea. If it's possible, would you like to elaborate more about sort of the language policy you were talking about from the top-down level perspective, like we have the national ideology from the leaders, some individual leaders, or we have sort of those, Borto also said it's a social habits. So we think English is important. We think English helps us to climb the social ladder to earn more money. So is it the social habit that promote the policy, or just some people is making the policy? I'll give it to.
Fabulous question.
I think she's lining herself up for a presenter at the next time.
Absolutely.
Getting herself in the mode. Come on, Kate.
Okay. Which way will I take this? I might take that question backwards, actually.
Yes.
To kind of, do the more kind of theoretical, like big question thing, and then some of the kind of more detailed stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think, so it's really interesting. So I've read Bourdieu really, really closely a couple of times for this, and you can imagine that I hadn't picked him up in, kind of a couple of years, and I find it quite difficult to kind of read really closely. And it's interesting, actually, that he's very clear, right, that for him, the way that he kind of talks about it in terms of the direction of travel, I guess, if you like, the kind of direction of influence, is very much that it's the linguistic market, and it's these kind of institutions like the school, like the judiciary, whatever they are, that are kind of habitus forming in themselves, right? So the way that Bourdieu seems to see it, and I'll talk about ISIS in a second. The way that Bourdieu seems to see it is that, at least if I'm reading it right, that kind of process of making social institutions favour English, for example, comes first. That's the primary thing. And that it's kind of based on almost a kind of practical or strategic understanding of how to make use of symbolic power to kind of retain dominance, right? As opposed to being something that is motivated by one's own habitus, by one's own kind of feeling of what English will do for the nation or whatever that might be. And then the habitus thing follows from that. And I think I agree with Bourdieu, broadly speaking. I mean, I think that if you get into the kind of detail of it, it's very difficult to separate out how much we're talking about a policy being motivated by the fact that the people who write it believe in the power of English, and how much it's motivated by the fact that they're English speakers and they've got shares in, whatever mining corporations they've got shares in. And if you look at the share portfolios of the people involved in random policy writing, then potentially telling. Yes, I think it's quite hard to kind of tease those things apart, but I suppose the way that I see it is that I don't think it can be solely motivated by habitus. I don't think it can be solely motivated by belief, because it seems to me that once these policies are enacted and it's so clear, and in a way, people who've been writing about African education systems more broadly have been kind of making this argument for 60 years, so the knowledge is there, that when you put in a kind of EMI system or something similar to it, when you put in some kind of English language or French language system or whatever, you're disadvantaging the majority. And I think that that's always been known, basically, since independence. And the fact that the state doesn't operate technocratically in that way, the fact that the state doesn't look at this body of research and say, okay, well, let's put in a progressive language policy, that's what suggests to me that it's less about belief, which I think could be challenged and kind of reshaped in line with the research that's out there, and more to do with strategy, and more to do with those kind of political goals, if you like. So I hope that answers the second part of the question.
Yes.
The second part is a brilliant question. In terms of the actual system and kind of how it works and how it works in practice and stuff, I mean, I write about this in the 2018 paper, so to some extent I'll kind of direct you there. And lots of people have written about it in lots of detail, actually. I mean, broadly speaking, right, so there's been a bit of flip-flopping, as we say, now that we're accustomed to our government doing its own flip-flopping, kind of become the term. There's been a lot of flip-flopping. So at the very beginning, the idea was that English would come in from primary one, so that it would be there right from the very beginning of the system, right to the end. And that was briefly overturned. I can't remember the exact date now, but it was a couple of years ago. And it was then made to be the case that English would start at primary four, which is more in line with education systems in Africa more broadly. And then remain English. And then very soon after that, they went back to English in primary one, and that's where things are now. So at the moment, English is supposed to be at least the language used all the way through, right?
I'm really sorry, Kate, but Michael's going to kill me if we don't stop soon.
Great. Okay. We can talk about more,
Yeah,
underprepared
very much.
teachers,
You guys are both
underfunded,
here.
these kind of things.
Yes.
Are all
Thank
important.
you.
So we don't have time for any other questions, I'm afraid. But look, she's here. She's in person. We can grab her. And our virtual guys, please feel free to email that address that you see on her PowerPoint. k.s.spowage@leeds.ac.uk. She will answer.
Yes, possibly slowly, but I will.
Thank you so much. So next up, we have a copy. And we're off to the Barbara Strang Teaching Centre again for the next workshop. And the copy is in the same place in Barbara Strang as it was before. Sorry for cutting it
No,
short.
that's fine, don't worry. Don't forget the clicker. I'll see